Condorcet's paradox leaves us slightly depressed. There is no decision. Intransitivity, irrationality at the group level. Individual rationality does not guarantee that the group is also rational. We end up in this situation of the cycling majorities, for example. So how do actual assemblies solve these problems? Well, one of the solutions is agenda setting. I should also note that this week's slides are in part based on Clark Golder and Golder's excellent Principles of Comparative Politics handbook. So what is agenda setting? Well, basically agenda setting means that one of the actors, the agenda setter, has the power to decide the order in which the votes would occur. For example, we could have first a vote whether there should be no deal or a deal, a soft Brexit kind of deal, for example, and then the winner would be pitted against Remain. Right? That was the idea in a confirmatory referendum. But we can think of other structures, of course. So technically, what is an agenda? Well, an agenda is a plan that determines the order in which the votes occur. And in our case, there are three possible agendas. Agenda 1, EU versus soft, then the winner against hard. Agenda 2, soft versus hard, then the winner against EU. And Agenda 3, EU versus hard, and the winner against soft. So how would this work in practice? So if the agenda setter were to decide to use agenda number 1, first pitting Remain versus soft, EU versus soft Brexit, and then the winner against the hard Brexit, what would happen? Well, in the first stage, EU versus soft, the EU option would win. Why? Because both the Remainers and the Ultras would vote for the EU option, which is the soft option, right? So both of these groups have a preference of EU over soft, and so they would vote for EU in this case. And then in the second stage, the winner EU would be pitted against hard Brexit, and in this case, the hard Brexit would win, as both Ultras and the Leavers prefer hard Brexit over Remain, over EU membership. So hard wins. What about the other agendas? Well, agenda number 2, soft versus hard Brexit, and then winner against EU. Well, soft versus hard Brexit, soft would win because both Remainers and Leavers prefer soft over hard, and therefore soft wins, and then the winner is pitted against the EU membership, and in this case both the Ultras and the Remainers would vote for EU membership, and so EU membership would win. And you already know where this is going. In the third agenda, what do we have? Well, we have first EU versus hard Brexit. In this case, hard Brexit would win because both the Leavers and the Ultras prefer hard Brexit over EU. And then the winner is pitted against, so hard Brexit is pitted against soft Brexit. And in this case, then soft Brexit wins because both the Remainers and the Leavers prefer soft Brexit over hard Brexit. So, if all these three groups vote sincerely for their preferences, then each of these three possible agendas, sequences of votes, produces a different outcome. What's more, the sequencing completely determines the outcome. So whoever the agenda setter is, whoever has the power to force this structure on the voting, gets to decide. So the agenda setter will of course choose the outcome that delivers their most preferred outcome. But wait a minute, maybe some of you already got stuck on this a little bit when I said vote sincerely, because I led you up the garden path a little bit. What's the problem with the agenda setters sort of reasoning above, where we said, okay, so they get to choose based on this? Well, the agenda setter, in all their strategic thinking glory, in this case, basically has assumed that one of the groups is naive. In this case, agenda 1, I said that EU versus soft, EU wins because both the Remainers and the Ultras vote for EU. But why would the Remainers, knowing that in the second stage they will lose and hard Brexit will occur, why would the Remainers vote in the first stage according to their true preferences. They wouldn't do this, of course. They would be strategic thinkers as well. Not only the agenda setter is strategic, also everyone else involved has to be a strategic thinker. So if they also act strategically, vote strategically in this case, then they know that in the second stage, hard Brexit will be the result. So they wouldn't vote for their true preference, EU, but they would perhaps vote for something else, namely for soft Brexit, which is not their preferred outcome, but at least they can avoid their least preferred outcome. Let's look at this in a little more detail, this strategic voting option here. So first we can draw something that very much should be familiar, that very much resembles a game tree for this agenda. So this is our first agenda, EU versus soft, and then the winner against hard Brexit. Huh? So this is just drawn out. So what happens here in this? Well, we have to use backward induction, of course. So we start at the last stage. At the last stage, there is no more strategic voting. Everybody votes for their true preference. Huh? So if the final contest is EU versus hard Brexit, the Remainers vote for EU, and the hard Brexiteers vote for, and both the Leavers and the Ultras vote for hard Brexit, and hard Brexit wins. And similarly, in the other subgame, soft versus hard, both the Remainers and the Leavers vote for soft Brexit, and only the Ultras vote for hard Brexit. So we can basically use backward induction. So in this subgame, hard wins, and in this subgame, soft wins. So looking at the first stage, this is what would happen if there was sincere voting. Both the Remainers and the Ultras would vote for EU over soft, and only the Leavers would for the soft Brexit. But really, that's not the choice they face, is it? We know from the sequential form games and from backward induction that in reality, some of these branches are never going to happen. And of course, these are strategic actors, so they look to the end of the game tree and they see that if we vote for EU in the first stage, we will end up with a hard Brexit. And if we vote for soft in the first stage, we will end up with a soft Brexit. So who's going to change their mind? The Ultras are not going to change their mind. They can still prefer hard Brexit over soft Brexit, because hard Brexit and soft Brexit are now the only options. The Leavers are also not going to change their vote, because they prefer soft Brexit over hard Brexit. But of course, the Remainers are not that naive. They would vote in this case, or should, for the soft Brexit over EU, because they know that voting for the EU, voting for Remain at that stage, will lead to the hard Brexit in the end. So the Remainers must know that their preferred option is no longer available, but at least they can avoid their worst possible outcomes and ensure the triumph of sort of their second best kind of outcome. And this would perhaps be one of the ways out of the scenario that Parliament found themselves in. So if everyone is strategic, not only the agenda setter, and the agenda setter knows that everyone else is strategic, and everyone else knows that everyone else is strategic, then the outcome of the agenda one is no longer hard Brexit, but it is really soft Brexit, because people anticipate the choices of the other player. What I would like you to do for a minute or so is pause the video and basically write down the other two possible agendas, and think about what you would change from the previous sort of sincere voting example, and what would be the outcome if everybody behaves strategically for agendas 2 and 3. Did you take a second to figure out what the outcomes are? If agenda 1 was the sequencer, then we would end up, if everybody behaves strategically, we would end up with a soft Brexit. If agenda 2 was the sequence, we end up with a hard Brexit. And if agenda 3 was the outcome, was the structure, then we would end up with Remain with EU membership. So, for every possible outcome, there exists an agenda that produces this outcome. So that's great, of course, that we've gotten out of this cyclical preference kind of situation, But that doesn't seem quite right. Huh? So this agenda setting power can produce outcome even in situations when there's otherwise an impasse. And if you think about the US Congress, you know, the Senate Majority Leader or committee chairman, they have tremendous power to choose sort of you know, what can be amended and what actually gets a vote. And so the structure can of course produce outcomes. That's great. But we have solved our sort of indecision problem at a terrible price. The agenda setter completely determines the outcome. The agenda setter is like a dictator. He or she just decides what the sequence of votes is, and therefore, given some knowledge about the underlying preferences, therefore is able to produce whatever they want. That doesn't sound like a particularly democratic kind of voting procedure. And also, so we've started with sort of a nice voting procedure, saying, okay, we need some structure here, etc. But we ended up with sort of agenda dictatorship. I also said at the beginning of the videos that there's always a bigger game. So what would be the bigger game here? Well, voting over who gets to be the agenda setter would, of course, be the key. So this is why these appointments and the structure in parliaments are so important, basically because agenda setters wield tremendous power. In our running example, this didn't save Theresa May. There were attempts to structure sequences of votes, but of course, if you don't have a majority for the vote on the process, you can't make this happen. So this only works if the process has been locked in some form. So agenda setting is one solution to the problem of cyclical majorities and the indecision and irrationality. But it's not a very fair one. So maybe we can come up with a better method, with a clever sort of voting system that works better than simple majority voting under these circumstances. And there are many really great ideas around sort of things that some people know as alternative vote or single transferable vote, and there are many, many other voting systems. Essentially, most of these voting systems work by eliciting more information from the voters. So they ask for the actual rank order, because the missing sort of internal ranking is what creates some of these cycles. So many of these voting systems basically ask you for a full ranking over the candidates or options or alternatives in our running examples. And one of these alternative voting system is what is called border count. Border was a contemporary of Condorcet's, another one of these 18th century math and social science geniuses. Okay, and how does border count work? Well, in our example, basically what voters do is they just rank order their choices. So the Remainers rank EU over soft over hard, and the Leavers soft over hard and EU, and so forth. And we know the percentages of MPs in our example. And so you just rank order the choices, and then you assign points based on the rank order. And you assign 0 to the last option, 1 to the next best, and so forth, to k-1 points to the top option, where k is number of alternatives. So in this example, the Remainers would assign 2 points to EU, 1 point to soft, and 0 points to hard. We could make a Eurovision version of this, I guess. And if I remember, I'll flag up Eurovision as a voting system later. Okay, so 2 points for EU, 1 point for soft, 0 points for hard for the Remainers, 2 points for soft for Leavers, 1 point for hard, 0 points for EU, and so forth. And we know what the percentages are, so let's assume there are 100 MPs to make the numbers a little more manageable. So 100 MPs. So if there are 100 MPs, what would this look like? Well, in the first column, you have the options, EU, soft, and hard Brexit. And in the next column, you have the votes or the points from the Remainers, right? So Remainers would assign 2 points to the EU. There are 48 Remainers out of 100. And so that makes 96 points. They would assign 1 point to the soft Brexit option. That's 48 times 1 point, that's 48, and they would assign 0 points to the hard Brexit option. What about the levers? Well, they would assign 2 points to the soft Brexit option, so that's 2 times 32 MPs, that's 64 points, and they would assign 1 point to the hard Brexit option, that's 32 times 1, that's 32, and they would assign 0 to the EU. And the ultras, what would they do? They would assign 20 points to EU, 0 to soft, and 40 to hard. So, in total, because there are 20 ultras. Okay, and so then we would add up these points given to the different alternatives, and we would get 116 points for EU, 112 points for soft Brexit, and 72 points for hard Brexit. In other words, if we use border count, given the preference orderings that we have, and assuming there's 100 MPs, then we would end up with a narrow lead for Remain or EU over soft Brexit, and hard Brexit gets kind of lost. And that sort of reflects the overall preferences and strengths of these groups. So maybe this is a great voting system, because it produces a certain outcome, but Parliament, of course, didn't change their rules to do this. But you can see how this can be a nice way to elicit information and to basically find a solution that both represents sort of the strength of preferences and or the order of the preferences and the relative strength of these groups. But border count is a nice sort of example for another problem with social choice rules. A new problem raises its ugly head, and that is what we call the independence of irrelevant alternatives, or IIA. Let's say we introduce an additional option, some new fungal EFTA option that nobody likes. So let's say there's a new sort of proposal, a fourth proposal being entered, and nobody really likes it. Nobody has it as their first preference. So the Remainers don't like it at all. The Leavers like it, third best, and the Ultras don't want it either. But that's the second best option. So maybe some alternative option. Okay, but essentially nobody wants this. It is added to the list of options, and what happens now? Well, let's count. Let's use border count on this one. Well, again, so we do the same thing. So let's look at the Remainers first. The Remainers rank the EFTA option last. So looking at the first column under R, under Remainers, the EFTA gets 0 points. Then hard Brexit gets 1 point times 48 Remainers, that's 48. Soft Brexit gets 2 points times 48 Remainers, that's 96 points. And EU membership gets 3 points times 48 Remainers, that's 144. What about the Leavers? The Leavers still give 0 to the EU, then 96, so 3 times 32 to the soft Brexit, 2 times 32, 2 points to hard Brexit, and 1 point times 32 Leavers to the EFTA option. And the Ultras give 20, so 1 point times 20 Ultras to the EU, 0 to soft, 3 points times 20 Ultras to hard, and 2 points times 20 Ultras to the EFTA option. But what has happened now? We have introduced an alternative that nobody really wanted, the EFTA option. We just made it up. And what happens as a consequence? The totals have changed. EU is no longer the winning option. Soft Brexit is now the winning option. Hard Brexit is second, and EU, the Remain option that was leading in the first scenario, is now only third. That's crazy. So we have introduced an irrelevant alternative, something that nobody really wanted. It has shifted the relative preference orderings a little bit, but not really that much. Nobody would think that EFTA was important. but we have gotten a reversal, a flip at the top. Suddenly EU loses and soft wins. How is that possible? So how can this be? Well, changing the rules for how a group votes changes the decision outcome. That's what we've experienced already. But even within the same decision rules, for example, in the border count method that we just learned about, arbitrary changes to the process, such as introducing this option that nobody wants. Nobody wanted the after option. Nobody had it as their first choice. Can change the outcome at the top. And the property that is violated here is what is called independence of irrelevant alternatives, or IIA. It's not a it's something we would want. It would be reasonable to expect that if all voters prefer A over B and this doesn't change, then the group preference ordering should also be A over B, even if we introduce or remove some alternatives around it. But it is in practice, as we will see, often violated. And these violations basically can occur in any of these rank-based or preference order-based voting systems. So you have to watch out for them. One of the really famous examples comes from the 2002 figure skating contest in the Olympics. Basically, what happened was something along the lines, I forget which skaters were on top. You had basically I think the American going first and doing very well, and the Russian goes and so forth, and then the third or fourth placed skater goes for the second program, and does a bit better, but doesn't get anywhere near the gold medal, and as a consequence, the gold medal and silver medalist flip. And people went crazy. They said, what is this? How can it be? These people went already. These are the points they should have gotten. How is it possible that this third skater impacts the two skaters that were expected to be gold and silver? How can it be reversed? How can this flip happen? And the figure skating people were furious, and they went to the social choice people and the political scientists and mathematicians and said, "Okay, look, fix it. This is bad. We don't want this. We don't want this to happen again." And the social choice theorists said, "Well, given your voting system, this will happen occasionally." We know this from more familiar surroundings, perhaps. If you think about spoiler candidates or parties, where you have one party that, if you looked at the true preference orderings of people, they should never support if they want someone else to win. So, for example, in the US, you often have green candidates standing that essentially take votes away from Democrat politicians, and then sometimes maybe the Republican wins. I think that I forgot which year was where it would have been sufficient to flip it, basically. And if we were to elicit these preferences from the Green voters, they surely would prefer the Democrat over the Republican candidate. But because they express their preferences, that doesn't happen. So that's a similar sort of logic, of course, but perhaps more familiar. But these preference reversals are a feature that is baked in to many sort of rank order based voting systems. So one of the key lessons here is that majority rule suffers practical problems. So we sometimes end up, depending on the voting rule that we use, but we end up with indecision, with intransitivity or irrationality, really, at the group level, even if everyone is sort of behaving perfectly rational on the individual level. And this is, Condorcet's paradox being the prime example. Another problem, of course, is, dictatorship. So we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want, the agenda setter, for example, to completely determine the outcome. And we also don't really want these weird preference reversals, where we get a flip at the top just because we introduce some alternative that nobody really wanted. Why does the American skater suddenly win or lose because a third or fourth ranked skater went as well? That's crazy. So we don't want cyclical majorities, we don't want a dictatorship, and we don't want independence of irrelevant alternatives. So political scientists and social choice theorists, come up with better voting systems? And they said, sure, we'll try. So there are many other voting systems, like I've already said. For example, single transferable vote, and our Australian friend can explain how it works. The alternative vote, and there was a referendum, of course, on this that failed in the UK. And most of these alternative voting systems are better in the sense that these kind of violations of these problems, or the emergence of these problems, is less frequent than in sort of plurality or majority kind of systems. So, of course, a key task for us as political scientists, perhaps, or economists or mathematicians is, can't we find some clever voting system that doesn't suffer from these weird problems? Unfortunately, the answer is a resounding no. This very unfortunate insight is due to Arrow's impossibility theorem. Basically, it states that these pathologies of majority rule apply to any preference aggregation system, any group decision procedure that meets some minimal standards of fairness. Essentially, we can't at the same time have non-dictatorship, the universal admissibility, so not restricting preference orderings, for example, anonymity or Pareto optimality, meaning that if everyone prefers A over B, then also the group decision rule should prefer A over B. That's also not a controversial request. And independence of irrelevant alternatives, so the violation of these weird preference reversals, or emergence of these weird preference reversals. If it is not possible to meet all of these four minimal fairness criteria, while also simultaneously guaranteeing that the group is able to make rational decisions and sort of avoid this cyclical majorities kind of scenario. And I would very much recommend you read the part of the Shepsley book that walks through this a little bit, sort of how we can provide the proof of this. I think you really need to let this sink in for a second. The conclusion of Arrow's impossibility theorem, impossibility result, is basically that there can be no perfect voting rule, no voting rule that fulfills these minimal fairness requirements. We're gonna have to give up some of this. Something's gonna have to go. And as a consequence, all voting systems are flawed, and we can only sort of choose among them. We will either have to live with preference reversals, or we get cyclical majorities and indecision, or we're delegating too much authority to an agenda setter, or we have other problems. But it gets even worse. For those of you who have read in the Shepsley book, the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem rears its ugly head. Basically, what they talk about is manipulation, manipulability. And their core finding is that every non-dictatorial social choice function is manipulatable for some distribution of preferences. So we saw the example of the voters in the parliament game, in the agenda setting situation, change their preference depending on their anticipation of what would happen in the end. And similar kind of shenanigans can happen in these voting rules. So, for example, if you are asked your true preference ordering over candidates. If you want to damage a certain candidate that is perhaps also from your side of the aisle, if you're sort of on the left and you don't like the social democratic candidate, then although you would in reality prefer this person maybe second over someone further away, you maybe rank them last to give them fewer points if it's border count or if it's single transferable vote in order to damage them. And these kind of manipulations and sort of misrepresentation of true preferences is rife and cannot be avoided. So every voting system has incentives to basically misrepresent your preferences. But of course, there's tremendous variation in how countries vote and how organizations vote. And there are trade-offs. So these manipulation problems, for example, are bigger and larger or less large depending on the voting system that is being used. So it's better in some cases and more dramatic in others. And of course, things like single member district plurality systems, like how parliamentary constituency are elected in the UK, is of course much more open to strategic voting and sort of misrepresentation of preferences than other voting systems. So some are better than others with respect to some of these features of the voting system, but there is no electoral system or no voting system that doesn't suffer from some of these flaws. And when I say better, we should also note that electoral systems, remember we talked about institutions a little bit and sort of the history, and electoral systems are not, of course, chosen to be the best electoral system. That would be nice, but that would be a bit naive. Again, there's always a bigger game. What do electoral systems reflect? What do electoral rules reflect? Do they reflect a best effort at sort of aggregating the preferences of citizens? No. They reflect the choices and the incentives and the interests of those who created the electoral system at the time. So famously, of course, the expansion of proportional representation systems in Europe, moving from majoritarian systems to PR systems, was partly a response to sort of the rise of labor movements and social democratic parties, and a way to secure power, aspects of power from the ruling class. So electoral systems, of course, aren't designed to be best, and there's always a bigger game, and in this case the game over the electoral system, of course, is the bigger question. And I leave you with an even more depressing quote. There's a very famous Joseph Stalin quote. I'm going to read it. And Stalin said, "It's enough that the people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything." Well, that may be true for a dictatorship, but there's a sort of a variation or addendum maybe to this rule for democracies. And that is the people who decide how we vote and how we count the votes decide everything. Or a lot. I don't know. In practice, we need not be depressed. Of course, voting systems are important, but we should be realistic about where they come from and what they do. And in practice, when we talked about accountability and institutions a little bit last week, and I gave you some references, maybe sort of this Schumpeterian view of democracy as sort of just a mechanism to replace the ruler somehow is something that we can find some solace in. And next week we'll also learn that the actual distribution of preferences helps. So of course, these preference reversals and the Condorcet's paradox, these kind of situations emerge. But if people's preferences are, can be captured, say, by a 1 or 2 or so dimensional continuum, perhaps we have fewer of these problems. And that's what we'll encounter a little bit next week when we talk about spatial models of voting.